Many of the bombers used by military commanders during World War II earned widespread recognition, yet only a select few achieved legendary status. Becoming a truly great aircraft required something that could never be designed on a blueprint or built inside a factory. It needed an extraordinary spark of brilliance that lifted it beyond simply being good. More than anything, it also needed a remarkable amount of luck. The fortune of being in the right place at exactly the right moment. It had to possess flight characteristics far above the ordinary, along with exceptional reliability, toughness, and combat performance. In the end, however, what truly completed its legacy was the unique bond it formed with the aircrews who came to admire and trust it. The Avro Lancaster possessed all of these qualities, and much more. Even with its power-operated turrets, those troublesome features that challenged wartime bomber designers trying to create smooth, streamlined aircraft. The Lancaster still carried a sense of elegance that made it truly impressive to look at. Its sleek aerodynamic design played a major role in its outstanding overall performance. Yet, like many exceptional aircraft, the true strength of its design came from its simplicity, with a strong structure perfectly suited for large-scale production. Without question, this became one of the biggest reasons behind its success. It was also incredibly versatile and proved to be an outstanding bomber in every respect. In the beginning, armed with 4,000-pound bombs and smaller weapons, the Lancaster delivered its warning deep into the heart of Germany. It did not take long, however, before it became the RAF's primary offensive weapon. By April 1942, it was carrying the 8,000-pound bomb, and by 1943 it advanced to the 12,000-pound version. During the early missions, navigation depended mostly on dead reckoning, while bomb aiming relied completely on visual methods. Over time, radar navigation systems such as Rebecca, G, and Oboe were introduced, and the H-2S radar bombing system, recognized by its distinctive semi-opaque blister beneath the rear fuselage, became standard equipment. Perhaps the most extraordinary offensive weapon ever carried by the Lancaster was the bouncing bomb, which would be used during one of its boldest and most famous missions. It was released by the legendary 617 Squadron against the strategically vital Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams in Germany's Ruhr region. Wartime Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, praised the Lancaster as the finest bomber of the entire war. He said its effectiveness was almost unbelievable, both in its performance and in its ability to carry ever heavier bomb loads without losing its strength. The Lancaster clearly outperformed every other heavy bomber of its time. Not only could it carry larger payloads, but it was also easier to fly, and, most importantly for its crews, its casualty rate remained consistently lower than that of the others. Among all the great aircraft that served throughout the war, many people firmly believe the Avro Lancaster was the greatest of them all. In sharp contrast to the Lancaster stood the awkward-looking Armstrong Whitley, better known as the Flying Barn Door. During the early years of the war, it was a familiar sight to people living along Britain's east coast. For the first 2 years of the conflict, the Whitley formed the backbone of the RAF bomber force, helping lay the foundation for the strategy of nighttime bombing. Although it was one of the least attractive bombers of the war, the Whitley still marked an important milestone in the development of the RAF's offensive strength. Very few, if any, bombers of the Second World War enjoyed a longer or more distinguished combat career than the Vickers Wellington. Tested in battle from the very beginning of the war, it carried the bulk of RAF Bomber Command's night bombing campaign until the arrival of the 4-engine heavy bombers, and it remained on the front line even when the war came to an end. In fact, the Wellington's outstanding combat record was so impressive that no tribute could fully capture the remarkable achievements this exceptional warplane earned throughout its service. The Wellington's gentle handling, combined with strong performance and an incredible ability to survive heavy battle damage, quickly made it a favorite among its crews. Its round, well-built appearance also earned it the nickname Wimpy, after the popular comic strip character. More than any other bomber, the Wellington proved that power-operated gun turrets could serve as highly effective defensive weapons. At the same time, however, it shattered the widely accepted belief that large bombers could carry out daylight raids against heavily defended targets without fighter protection. Like many successful combat aircraft, the Wellington was the product of teamwork. But its greatest strength undoubtedly came from its revolutionary geodetic, or basket weave, construction. This brilliant concept was created by Barnes Wallis, and what made it even more impressive was its remarkable simplicity. Before the end of 1939, the Wellington earned one unfortunate distinction. It taught the RAF a harsh lesson: that flying large bombers in daylight without fighter escort was simply not practical. That reality became painfully clear when 10 Wellingtons were shot down and 3 more badly damaged from a formation of 24 during an armed reconnaissance mission over Wilhelmshaven. After that, the Wellington was never again sent on unescorted daylight operations, except with Coastal Command. Once it was assigned to the nighttime bombing role, the Wellington achieved outstanding success, leading the RAF's night bombing campaign against Germany. The Wellington was an aircraft truly worthy of the Royal Air Force and deserving of the honor of carrying the name of one of Britain's greatest soldiers. As the war continued, many new bombers entered service, but none earned a finer reputation. When the Bristol Blenheim first appeared in the summer of 1936, it was immediately recognized as a major breakthrough in combat aircraft design, placing the British aircraft industry at the forefront of fast daytime bomber development. It became the first modern, all-metal cantilever monoplane with stressed skin construction to enter production for the Royal Air Force, marking the beginning of a new era in the RAF's equipment. For several years, there had been growing concern over the outdated state of the RAF's operational aircraft, a concern made even greater by rapid developments in other countries. The arrival of the Blenheim, with its enormous technological improvements over the aircraft it replaced, did much to ease those fears. More than any other aircraft, it signaled the end of the fighting biplane. It established a new standard for light bomber design that other nations were quick to copy. Even so, the Blenheim was destined never to live up to the great expectations placed upon it. Chosen as one of the key aircraft to help re-equip the rapidly expanding RAF during the late 1930s, the Blenheim entered service with performance that allowed it to outrun most fighters of its time. However, the rapid pace of combat aircraft development during the final years of peace in Europe meant that, by the time the RAF entered the war in September 1939, it quickly became clear that the Blenheim was not the weapon it had been expected to be. Its weaknesses soon became obvious in the harsh reality of air combat. It proved dangerously vulnerable to fighter attacks and lacked both adequate defensive armament and armor. Even so, it carried much of the burden of fighting on every front where the RAF was engaged during the first 3 years of the Second World War. Despite its shortcomings, it served with great courage. A comparison can easily be made between the Blenheim and the Curtiss P-40. Like the American fighter, it received both praise and criticism, admiration and condemnation. Yet it was the aircraft that was available at the time, and no matter how divided opinions were about its effectiveness, the Blenheim remains one of the truly historic aircraft of the war. The short Stirling was more than just the Royal Air Force's first true heavy bomber of the Second World War. It was the only British 4-engine bomber designed from the very beginning, with 4 engines to enter operational service during the conflict. Both the Lancaster and Halifax had originally evolved from twin-engine designs. Carrying bomb loads far heavier than anything previously imagined, the Stirling became one of the most significant milestones in RAF history. Even so, the official history of the RAF during the Second World War described the Stirling as a disappointment. As a result, its time as a frontline heavy bomber was relatively short. Despite this, as the RAF's first operational 4-engine heavy bomber of the war, the Stirling secured an important place in the history of the service. The Avro Lancaster, which came before the Lancaster, was not a successful bomber. It proved to be unreliable, lacked sufficient power, and failed to meet expectations. Only 209 aircraft were built, and its production lasted for little more than a single year. After overcoming a few early problems, the Handley Page Halifax developed into an exceptional aircraft. It remained in service until the very end of the war, firmly holding its place as one of the Royal Air Force's two main heavy bombers. The Hampton was one of the world's most advanced warplanes when it first entered service, and it came from a proud aviation heritage. From a pilot's perspective, it was a forgiving aircraft, and its easy handling made it a pleasure to fly. Small enough to remain highly maneuverable, its cockpit provided an outstanding fighter-style view, while its wide speed range made it an impressively capable aircraft. Named after William Mitchell, the visionary American colonel of the 1920s, who was court-martialed for boldly speaking out about the importance of air power, and was later posthumously promoted to the rank of general, the North American B-25 was perhaps the finest, all-around light-medium bomber of the Second World War. Reliable in combat. This easy-to-fly and highly adaptable aircraft delivered excellent overall performance, and with its outstanding handling qualities, it became one of the most popular combat aircraft among Allied aircrews. Even if the Mitchell had never flown another combat mission, it would still have earned its place among the most historic aircraft of the war, because of its daring attack on Tokyo in 1942. Launched from the flight deck of the US Hornet. More Mitchells were built than any other American twin-engine bomber, with no fewer than 9,816s accepted by the USAF, although many were later supplied to the British, Soviet, and other Allied air forces. At its peak, the USAF never operated more than 2,656 Mitchells at one time. Yet this outstanding bomber left its mark on every major theater of the Second World War. As one of the select few Allied aircraft to serve on every major battlefront of the conflict, the Mitchell established an unmatched record of service. Few aircraft better demonstrate how a basic design could be continuously improved to meet the demands of war than this remarkable bomber, which continued serving in the air forces of many nations long after the war had ended. 317. Target at your 3 o'clock. Come on, guys. Get out of that plane. Bail out. There's one, he just came out through the bomb bay. Yeah, I see him. The tail gunner is coming out now. Watch for gunfire. Keep your eyes on him, Bill. Do you see any parachutes? No. None. At 9 o'clock, between 8 and 9, someone is still inside that B-17. Come on. The rest of you, get out of there. 12 o'clock. 109 at 3 o'clock. Very few aircraft of the Second World War earned the lasting admiration of their crews over such a long period of service as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. This legendary aircraft led the American strategic bombing campaign in Europe from the beginning of the war to the very end, while also serving in every other major theater of the conflict. No other single aircraft played a greater role in defeating the Luftwaffe, both in the skies and on the ground, than the Fortress. It made it possible for the United States to put its controversial strategy of daylight bombing against Germany into action, despite fierce political debate and determined enemy resistance. One interesting aspect of the Fortress's history is that it became known as the leading Allied daylight bomber, even though, in many areas of performance, it was inferior to its contemporary. The B-24 Liberator. The bomb load carried by USAF fortresses over Europe was often no greater than that of the much smaller de Havilland Mosquito. Fewer fortresses were built than Liberators, with 12,677 accepted by the USAF between July 1940 and August 1945. At their peak, these aircraft equipped a maximum of 33 overseas combat groups by August 1944. The Fortress earned its legendary reputation because of several exceptional qualities. Among the most important were its outstanding high-altitude performance and its incredible ability to survive severe battle damage. Later versions also featured extremely powerful defensive armament. Although the Fortress reached its full combat potential only after a lengthy period of development. It dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on targets across Europe during the war. By comparison, the B-24 Liberator dropped 452,508 tons, while all other aircraft combined dropped 463,544 tons. According to records kept by its manufacturer, the Fortress destroyed 23 enemy aircraft for every 1,000 sorties, compared with 11 for the B-24 Liberator, 11 for United States fighters, and only 3 for all United States light and medium bombers combined. Although later research showed that the Fortress's extremely high claims of enemy aircraft destroyed were greatly overstated, there is no doubt that its actual total was still impressive. Through its unmatched years of frontline service, the Fortress firmly established itself as one of the greatest bomber designs in aviation history. Its outstanding performance became a powerful confirmation of the air strategy and bomber design principles developed by a handful of visionary American airmen and engineers long before the outbreak of the Second World War. Although the Boeing Superfortress earned everlasting fame as the first aircraft to drop an atomic weapon, bringing the war in the Pacific to a sudden end, it also deserves recognition as one of the Allies' most important weapons in the fight against Japan. The long, difficult, and costly island-hopping campaign across the Pacific was carried out largely to capture bases from which the Superfortress could launch attacks against the Japanese homeland. Once those bases were secured, the superfortresses of the United States 20th Air Force began a relentless campaign, systematically destroying Japan's industrial cities one after another with devastating firebombing attacks. Because Japanese cities were filled with closely packed buildings made from lightweight materials, they were especially vulnerable to incendiary bombing. In some urban areas, the destruction caused by the Superfortress reached an astonishing 99.5%. Along with these devastating attacks on strategic targets, the Superfortresses also carried out a highly successful campaign of laying naval mines in Japan's home waters, placing a severe economic and logistical blockade on the islands of Nippon. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki therefore served as the final blow, though they were considered essential to bring the war to a quicker end. The Superfortress played a major role in Japan's final defeat and surrender without the need for an invasion, becoming the aircraft that ultimately proved the vision of America's early advocates of strategic air power. The Superfortress made a tremendous impact on the future of bomber design. It was the heaviest production warplane of the Second World War and the first pressurized aircraft to be built on a large scale. It also became the first aircraft to make widespread use of remotely controlled gun systems. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of its story was that it was designed, built, tested, and placed into operational service in just 4 years. Although every bomber had its loyal supporters, the Consolidated Liberator was often overshadowed in fame, though not in accomplishment, by the Boeing Fortress during the Second World War. This was despite the fact that the Liberator was built in far greater numbers than the Fortress and was produced in larger quantities than any other American aircraft. That extraordinary production record is even more impressive, considering it was such a large 4-engine bomber. The Liberator served on more battlefronts, remained in service for a longer period, and was built in more different versions than any other Allied or Axis bomber. Compared with the Fortress, the Liberator was certainly no beauty. Its deep, box-shaped fuselage and huge barn door-like vertical tail fins gave little impression of speed or agility. However, one of the Liberator's greatest strengths, and a quality shared by every truly outstanding warplane, was its remarkable versatility. Besides strategic bombing, it performed equally well in maritime patrol, anti-submarine warfare, passenger and cargo transport, aerial refueling, photographic reconnaissance, and many other roles. This exceptional flexibility was one of the main reasons why an incredible 18,188 Liberators and their variants were built for the USAF between the delivery of the first production aircraft in June 1941 and the closure of the final assembly line on May 31, 1945. Beyond its unmatched production record, the Liberator secured a lasting place in aviation history through its extraordinary achievements. Whether it was carrying bombs, depth charges, fuel, cargo, troops, or important passengers, the Liberator earned a reputation that few aircraft could match for successfully completing almost any mission, under almost any conditions. In many ways, the combat career of the Douglas A-20 was far less dramatic than that of many other wartime bombers. It was not involved in any famous operations, yet it remained on the front lines throughout the entire war. It did not earn its reputation on one particular battlefield, but served with equal distinction across them all. It performed just as effectively in Russia as it did in the Pacific and the Western Desert, while also being one of the most enjoyable combat aircraft for pilots to fly. Known as the Havoc by the Americans and the Boston by the British, the A-20 was truly a pilot's aircraft. Its strengths were praised in many different languages, from Afrikaans to French, from British to Ukrainian. As it was flown not only by American and Australian crews, but by many others as well. Its international character was built into its origins, as its development was greatly influenced by the Spanish Civil War and later by France's urgent need to rearm. The warning signs of 1936 had not gone unnoticed in the United States, and leading aircraft manufacturers were already preparing for the future needs of the United States Army Air Corps long before any official military requirements had been announced. Perfectly suited to the low-level bombing role, the Boston, or Havoc, proved adaptable, dependable, easy to handle, and exceptionally effective. Although it was often overshadowed by the more dramatic achievements of other bombers, the A-20 still ranked among the finest combat aircraft ever produced by the American aviation industry. No combat aircraft of the Second World War, whether from the Allied or Axis powers, underwent more modifications and adaptations than the Junkers Ju-88. Serving in many different versions throughout the entire European war and still being built when the conflict came to an end, the Ju-88 became the true backbone of the Luftwaffe. More of these bombers were produced than all other German bombers combined, with around 15,000 built between 1939 and 1945. Originally designed for one purpose, the Ju-88 was repeatedly adapted to carry out many different roles, and it performed each one with remarkable success. Like every combat aircraft, it had its weaknesses. Most of these resulted from changes forced by the desperate needs of Germany's overstretched and exhausted defenses during the final stages of the war. Even with those shortcomings, there is little doubt that the Ju-88 was the finest German bomber to see widespread operational service. This aircraft was created after a meeting in 1935 between senior officers of the newly formed Luftwaffe and Germany's leading aircraft designers. During that meeting, they outlined the need for a Schnellbomber, a medium bomber with the speed of a fighter. Junkers was eventually awarded the contract, and the prototype completed its maiden flight in 1936. From the very beginning of the war, the Ju-88 proved to be an outstanding success, serving on every front and in almost every possible role. Besides operating as a medium bomber, it also flew as a night fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, torpedo bomber, mine layer, and eventually even as the lower section of the manned missile flying bomb. Highly respected by the Allies, the Ju-88 came to represent the German approach of using one excellent basic airframe for many different missions instead of producing numerous specialized aircraft that would make manufacturing more complicated. It is fair to say that if the Ju-88 had not adapted so well to the countless modifications and new roles assigned to it, the Luftwaffe would have faced serious difficulties much earlier in the Second World War. Very few people living in London and the counties of southern England during the dramatic months of 1940 failed to recognize the distinctive and unsettling sound of the Heinkel He-111's engines. As the first modern medium bomber introduced into the Luftwaffe, it carried the greatest share of Germany's bombing campaign against the British Isles during the main stage of the Battle of Britain. Although its weaknesses became increasingly noticeable as the war continued, Many caused by the constant modifications and improvised changes made to the aircraft, the He-111 remained the Luftwaffe's standard combat bomber throughout the conflict. Built in large numbers, it was removed from mass production twice, only to return when the newer aircraft meant to replace it failed to enter service. During the opening stages of the war, the Heinkel He-111 was unquestionably a powerful offensive weapon. It was an elegant, carefully designed, and well-built aircraft with excellent flying qualities. It was truly a thoroughbred, inheriting its graceful shape from its single-engine predecessor, the He-70 Blitz, which, when it first appeared, was widely recognized as the most aerodynamically advanced aircraft ever built. Like many German military aircraft of its time, the He-111 was first introduced to the world as a civilian aircraft. Yet its sleek, streamlined fuselage clearly showed that it had been designed for maximum performance rather than passenger comfort. From the very beginning, it had been intended as one of the Luftwaffe's main weapons for the future Blitzkrieg, placing Germany at the forefront of medium bomber development. However, because the German aircraft industry failed to produce a suitable replacement, the He-111 remained in service far longer than originally planned. By the time it was called upon to carry the main burden of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against the British Isles, it was already beginning to show its age. Despite constant improvements, it could not keep up with the rapidly changing demands of air warfare, and during the final years of the conflict, it was no longer the fearsome weapon that had led Germany's attack on Poland. One design that did successfully enter production was the Junkers Ju-188, a twin-engine medium bomber that first saw combat in 1942. As early as 1939, Junkers had been developing the Ju-288, a completely new and far more advanced aircraft than any of its predecessors. But when it became clear that the Ju-288 would not be ready in time to meet the requirement for service by 1942, the Luftwaffe decided that the Ju-88 should instead be modified to meet the new need. As a result, the Ju-188 was created as an interim solution. The basic approach was straightforward. Junkers used the forward fuselage of the Ju-88, combined it with a newly designed wing and tail section, and produced a new aircraft. Originally known as the Ju-88E, the designation was later changed to Ju-188E. The first aircraft left the factory in June 1942 and entered operational service as a dive bomber. However, because of the increasingly strong Allied defenses, it was not especially successful in that role. It was therefore reassigned as a medium-level bomber and later as a torpedo bomber for attacking Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Further improvements eventually adapted the Ju-188 into a night fighter for defending Germany against the growing Allied strategic bombing campaign. To increase its speed and operating altitude without the delays of creating an entirely new aircraft, a high-altitude version with a pressurized cockpit was also developed. This later became known as the Ju-388. In 1944, the Ju-188's mission changed once again when it was assigned as a pathfinder during that year's bombing campaign against England. Serving from 1942 until the end of the war across the European, Mediterranean, Arctic, and Eastern fronts, the Ju-188 proved to be one of the Luftwaffe's most important operational aircraft because of the many different roles it successfully performed. Bomben auf England, Bombs on England, was the title of a powerful military song that echoed from loudspeakers across Germany and the occupied territories during the autumn of 1940. Accompanied by the thunder of aircraft engines and the beat of marching drums, it sounded like a stirring anthem of war. Yet, whatever effect it had on the German public, it did little to lift the spirits of the Luftwaffe's aircrews. They knew their bombers lacked the range to strike much beyond a limited part of the British Isles. They also understood that because the Luftwaffe had no true long-range strategic bomber, the RAF could concentrate nearly all of its defensive strength within that restricted area, the very area the Luftwaffe was forced to attack. They realized this limitation would steadily weaken their offensive power. Although prototypes of 4-engine heavy bombers had been built, they were abandoned before reaching mass production. Instead, Germany relied on the Heinkel He 177 Greif, a long-range heavy bomber that would become one of the greatest disappointments in the history of the German aircraft industry during the war. Engine fires, aerodynamic problems, and structural failures all combined to make this large bomber deeply unpopular with its crews once it entered operational service. These problems were recognized far too late, and even then too little effort was made to solve them. The aircraft's basic design was not at fault, and had those issues been properly addressed, the Luftwaffe might have possessed a heavy bomber equal to, or even better than, the finest Allied aircraft of its class. Appropriately named Greif, its greatest distinction was that it became the only German heavy bomber produced in significant numbers during the war. In fact, it was one of the very few completely new German combat aircraft to progress from the drawing board into frontline service. Unfortunately, its potential was undermined by the German aircraft industry's inability to fully refine and perfect the design. Celebrated by German propaganda as the scourge of Europe, the terror of conquered nations, and the ultimate weapon, the awkward-looking Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber gained greater notoriety than perhaps any other weapon Germany used to begin the Second World War. It was also one of the most vulnerable combat aircraft ever built, slow, difficult to maneuver, and an easy target for enemy fighters. Yet within the first 9 months of the conflict, it had already earned an almost legendary reputation. Even the German air staff was divided over the value of dive bombing and the Ju-87 itself. However, the campaign in Poland appeared to prove its supporters right, as the Ju-87 destroyed strongholds, artillery positions, and troop concentrations whenever Polish forces attempted to resist. When Germany invaded France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the Ju-87 repeated those successes, smashing Allied armored units and defensive positions, disrupting entire armies, crippling communications behind the front lines, and relentlessly attacking streams of fleeing refugees. With almost no opposition in the air, the Ju-87 was able to take full advantage of the pinpoint accuracy offered by steep dive bombing, while also creating a devastating psychological impact on those caught beneath its attacks. The Ju-87, however, depended entirely on German control of the skies. That reality became clear during the Battle of Britain, after only a few unsuccessful missions in which formations of Ju-87s were torn apart by RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires. The dive bombers were withdrawn from operations over the English Channel, bringing their brief period of dominance to an end. From an aerodynamic standpoint, the Ju-87 was anything but graceful. Its appearance bordered on the absurd, and against modern fighters it was almost defenseless. Even so, its unmistakable silhouette inspired fear wherever it appeared. And this single aircraft forever changed the very nature of modern warfare.